Welcome to the Wheeler Centre to question time about obesity, which is a fascinating topic, and it's great to see so many of you out here this evening. 1/3 of Australian adults are obese. That's twice as many as were 20 years ago. When we talk about obesity in Australia, we tend to talk about it in terms of it being a ticking time bomb, in terms of our health, but also really in terms of the public purse and the cost that obesity and being overweight is going to have as we all get older and bigger. So why are we as a nation and a world, why are we getting fatter? What are the actual health effects and the population effects? Is this, in fact, the public health crisis that it's being portrayed as, or is it not? These are some of the obvious questions, but tonight we're also going to be trying to get into some of the less obvious questions about size. Is it possible to be fat and healthy? The growing fat acceptance movement tells us that it is, amongst lots of other things about the size that we are. Is our obsession with being fat, with not being fat, actually making our children fatter? That's something that people are increasingly getting to wonder about. And then there is that moral edge to obesity as well, about somehow we seem to see being thin as being good and being fat as being weak and lazy. Is that correct? Well, there are plenty of people here who will say that that is not the case. And we do really have a very interesting panel tonight. When I saw the panel that they put together tonight, I thought, oh, this is so great. We're going to have such a fantastic evening this evening. So I'll start with Mary over on the end. Mary is the Chief Executive Officer of the National Heart Foundation, Mary Barry. Jenny Lee is a lecturer in creative writing, literary studies and gender studies at Victoria University here in Melbourne. She researches in fat studies and creative writing, and she's an active supporter of the fat acceptance movement. Ange Barry is the Chief Executive Officer of the Stephanie Alexander Kitchen Garden Foundation, and in the time that she's been CEO, it's blossomed from 3 schools in Victoria to 800 schools right across Australia now, which is quite an achievement. Mm-hmm. And Michael Gard, he's an out-of-towner. He's come down from Brisbane to be with us this evening. He's an Associate Professor of Sport, Health and Physical Education at UQ, which is a title which I think makes you sound a bit like a highly qualified PE teacher, but that's really not what you are. Your research focuses on how the human body is used, experienced, educated and governed, and your latest book on the subject that we're talking about tonight is called The End of the Obesity Epidemic, which challenges many of the more apocalyptic claims about obesity. So in case you haven't been to one of these before, this is full Q&A, so this is over to you. This is your chance to ask questions of the assembled experts here this evening. So if you want to ask a question, please just put up your hand. You can either try and catch my eye, or we've got 2 ushers over here, catch their eye, and they'll come and bring the microphone to you. We'll finish at about 7:15. In fact, we'll finish bang on at 7:15. And I always find we have more questions than we have time to have our questions answered. So if you've got a burning question, get in early would be my advice to you. But I wanted to start with you first, Michael, just to lay out really a little bit your own thoughts about the obesity epidemic as it is portrayed. You seem to think it's all getting a little bit hysterical.
Well, there is no doubt that obesity and the rates of obesity and overweight have increased in most countries around the world. They haven't increased everywhere, but most parts of the world that has happened. It has also happened at a time when human populations have lived longer and lived more healthily. You only have to pick up any edition of the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare's report on the health of Australians, and it will tell you that we live longer, healthier, more risk-averse lives.
And when you're saying we, do you mean Australia or do you mean a global population?
Well, you could take your pick, really. You could go to England or any of the industrialised democracies, and you'll see a similar kind of story. Most of the diseases from which people die are declining, and this is happening at a time when obesity rates have increased, although I have to say that we still do hear people say that obesity rates are skyrocketing, for example. And the truth is obesity rates have changed very little. At least in the last decade, and certainly for children in particular, they have changed very little in Australia for 15 years. So it is certainly the case that rising rates of overweight and obesity have some health consequences, and that is undeniable. But we do need to get into proportion. Obesity and overweight are one of the mid-range health problems that this country and Western countries face. We can't ignore it. But when we overstate the problem, we risk entering a hysterical space where the policies that we create are unwise, expensive, wasteful, and in some cases I have seen, and I'm happy to talk about them, but are just ridiculous. Mm-hmm. We do know that doing something about population levels of overweight and obesity is very tricky. The shorthand in that space is nothing works. So before we start doing a lot of things that don't work, we should think about it. How serious is the problem? Is this a good idea? And what are the potential unintended consequences, for which there are always unintended consequences?
And Mary, from your perspective of the National Heart Foundation, do you think that the problems with obesity and overweight in Australia are overstated?
Well, we see obviously there is an increase, as correctly pointed out, in the number of people who are overweight or obese in our community. And we now have about two-thirds of our population who are looked at as overweight or obese, compared on body index, etc. So the concern for the Heart Foundation is that being overweight or obese are key risk factors for cardiovascular disease, that's heart attack and heart disease. So we are obviously looking at ways to try and encourage people to eat healthily and to have what we call a healthy weight. We don't look at skinny or fat or anything like that. The Heart Foundation promotes a healthy weight, and that will be different for different people. So we like to see people eating healthily, eating a balanced diet, which means that they should eat every type of food, but a lot of foods in moderation, such as sweet foods, biscuits, sugary drinks, etc. We really say very, very, very small amounts of those, only in moderation as a special treat. But we do like to promote a good, balanced, healthy diet. We don't like fad diets. We don't believe in cutting out food groups completely. So we try and look at it from a holistic point of view to encourage healthy eating, healthy choices, enable people to try and make a better choice, and to look at how they're cooking, how they're preparing food, and what they're putting into it. So we really come at it from that point of view, and we also link it in with sedentary behaviour, which we can talk about maybe later on.
And Jenny, your perspective is not only from the health perspective, but yours is very much looking at the moral space around how we view people who are fat, people who are overweight, people who are obese. I mean, you said that you don't like the word obese, but you're very happy to say fat. Can you talk to us a little bit about, the fat acceptance movement, which is something that people may not have heard of?
Yes, sure. Look, I haven't met a large person who likes to be called obese. I think it's a medical term. Not everybody likes to reclaim the word fat. I like to think of it as a descriptor, the way you'd use thin or tall, and that you can separate the word fat from from other words that you might associate with it, like traditionally words like lazy or gluttonous or stupid, or these kinds of negative words that you sometimes see attached to fat, or like bullying in the school ground and so on. I suppose tonight I'd like to talk a bit about what happens when a fat person decides that they're not going to restrict their food anymore, whether that be by diet or lifestyle change, that they may or may not seek health or health-seeking behaviour. And in that circumstance, what's the attitude towards those people that decide they're going to perhaps follow a model like Health at Every Size, which is more about well-being and holistic health, including mental health, sleep, yes, movement that you might enjoy, and food as well, but doesn't rely on losing weight or the scales. So my perspective there is that weight is an outcome that's complex. Behaviour, when we talk about healthy behaviour, I don't like to see it linked to obesity because I think that is a stereotype, that people who are obese are unhealthy and people who are thin are healthy. So I like to deconstruct that. So the fat acceptance movement...
Is that not true, that people who are overweight are unhealthy and people who are thin are healthy?
Well, the other thing to remember, these categories, which Michael can talk a bit more about probably, that BMI was never designed to be used for individuals. It was a statistical tool to look at populations. So when you look at this person is a normal weight, this person is overweight, this person's obese, those are arbitrary. When you think about where's that line, why is that line there, who's decided that's where you should be? And I am more about there's a diversity of people, a diversity of hair colour, of height, and a diversity of body size. And when you start to shame one particular body size in our culture, then you start to stigmatise those people. You also get negative health effects from that, quite negative effects from stigmatised bodies. There are so many women in our culture, fat and thin, who hate their bodies. And my concern is what Michael mentioned about the unintended consequences of, say, public health movements, is that you can create or add to these problems of stigmatising particular bodies.
Okay, and Ange, you're involved in a public health movement. I think it's probably fair to call that, isn't
Yes.
it? From a very young age, and tell us a little bit about what the Kitchen Gardens Foundation does and what you are aiming to achieve with that.
Yeah, absolutely. We're aiming to, I guess, reconnect children, or Australians, but at childhood, with the joy of food and the pleasure of food. And I think that the relationship between people and food has changed immensely over the last probably 60 or 70 years. And we find a lot of children don't understand that food is seasonal and it comes from the ground or it comes off a tree. They often believe that it comes in plastic from the supermarket, and there's nothing wrong with having tomatoes all year round or that sort of thing. So what the program is aiming to do is reconnect our basic primal instinct and joy in growing our own food, and therefore knowing that it's the right food because it's mine and it's delicious because I know how to cook it. So children at school are having their own vegetable gardens where they tend to them, and they also have cooking lessons where they will prepare their dishes and then they'll sit down together and eat them. And we're talking about 8 to 11-year-old children who obviously are at that habit-forming stage of life, and their self-esteem and their sense of success is beautiful to witness. And these children do not need to be told that food is healthy, because the food they like to eat is their food, the food they've grown from scratch, and it is fresh and it is seasonal, and it's beautiful because they know how to cook it. And so you see fantastic peer-to-peer influence occurring around the table. And you also see parents coming in saying, my children don't eat vegetables, and the teachers saying, well, they absolutely do at school. I was having a conversation today where one of the most favourite recipes around the schools is called Salad of the Imagination, and that's where the children can use whatever they've harvested from the garden to create a salad. And if you can imagine seeing a group of 8-year-olds make their own salad, it's pretty impressive. The other piece of this is we often get asked, but what does primary school have to do with food and well-being? And our answer to that is, well, food is such a practical, primal need for all of us. If we can't find maths and literacy and history and science in food, we're doing something very wrong. So our job is to do just that for the teachers and to show how all those traditional or academic learning type streams are connected to food, and food connects everybody together.
But just to be clear, there's no stated aim at all of reducing obesity in children by helping children to...
Yeah, well, look, we haven't actually specifically said that our aim is to definitely reduce obesity. What we want to do is increase the well-being of children and the health of children, and a population actually starting at that childhood age. So the children themselves become great ambassadors and will often go home and cook for families. And from our experience, the skill and knowledge in growing food and cooking food has been lost now for about 2 generations. So there's a real fear factor, and we see that amongst parents, but we also see it amongst teachers. And so the children are the ones who say, come on, come and learn next to me and I'll teach you how to do it. And we see 8-year-olds educating adults all the time, which is really exciting.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Has anyone got any questions at this stage wanting to open up? I'll throw it open to the audience before. I have a list of about 556 questions. So if you would like to get any of your own questions in, please don't be shy. Just down there.
Hi, I saw the headline of a study the other day, which I didn't read the full one, so I'm wondering if you know anything about it. But it said that eating the same amount of calories and the same amount of food today, if we ate the same in the 80s, we would still be fatter today. So it was food and exercise. Any ideas why or where that might come from?
You're going to have to say that again. Sorry.
Yes, it was pretty mind-blowing. But the same amount of... If we did the same amount of food and exercise today as we did in the 80s, we would still be fatter as a population today.
Okay. And do you know where that came from?
I don't remember. As I said, I didn't read the whole study. But it was in the Sydney Morning Herald the other day.
Look, it's really important to put our thinking caps on and to think about the ways in which studies like that make their way into the press. Let's just be clear about a couple of things. We don't know how much the average Australian eats. We don't know how much the average Australian exercises. If you go into the literature, you can find people who will say day and people who will say night. That is, we are eating more, no we're not, we're eating less. We're exercising more, no we're exercising less. A review of the reviews of literature in this space recently just said, of all the studies that have tried to work out why we've got fatter, what's the consensus? And the consensus is we don't know. Some of the reviews say X, some of the reviews say Y, some of the reviews say we don't know. What we should take from that is that we should avoid glib generalisations of the kind that sometimes find their way into academic studies but frequently find their way into media reporting of academic work in this area. It's very difficult to generalise about obesity in Australia or the southern parts of the United States or northern England or Scotland, which is very different. They appear to be very different circumstances at play. So I guess my answer to that would be I would just be sceptical about glib conclusions about what is a very complicated and controversial and contested area of knowledge. It's trickier than that. I think our enemy in this space is certainty. And
just to pick up on something that you said in your first question, in the answer to your first question, Michael, you talked about some policies which are frankly wrong-headed. I'd like to know what you think some of those policies are.
Oh, how long have you got? Look, there are a couple that might strike you as kind of middle of the road, I guess. So around food labelling, and recently the Mayor of New York tried to impose a ban on the sale of very large soft drink containers. Scandinavia has tried banning food advertisements during certain times of the day. On the whole, they don't work, and most of them have been tried and stopped. But also, on the other hand, you have to ask questions about what is the unintended, what is the collateral damage when a government tells you what you can eat?
What do you think that is?
Well, what we know in some social sciences is that if you take away people's right to choose, you take away or you degrade their ability to choose. I think that's a fairly secure social science premise. That is, if people, you only have to look at life under the Iron Curtain, which I know sounds like a bit of a stretch, but in general, one of the lessons we would draw from that experience is that people just get used not to making choices for themselves. So if you make choices for people, they will either resist or they will get less good at making those choices. I've just been involved in a bunch of forums in Brisbane, and here going from the sublime to the ridiculous, where it is now quite widespread for teachers to send children's lunchboxes home or to throw the food out at school. Here's the thing. Whether you think that's a good idea or a bad idea, I actually think, can you imagine the mortification of the child involved who has to go through that? But nobody knows whether it works. It's a classic reaction in a context in which we are told we have a crisis. It makes sense in a crisis. It doesn't make sense any other time. So the issue, to answer your question, the issue is that because we're told in a crisis, lots of people think we just need to do something, anything will do. And under those circumstances, you have the recipe, you have the perfect conditions for ill-advised, wasteful, silly policies.
Mary, I suspect that you may take some issue with that. I mean, it is, the food pyramid is the National Heart Foundation food pyramid that was, isn't it? Is that from the National Heart Foundation?
It's from the Australian Dietary Guidelines,
right,
which we base all our advice on.
Sure, but I mean, the national, I mean, just when you were speaking, you talked about trying to help people make better choices. And so you do think that there is a role for people, organisations such as yourselves and perhaps even government, in actually helping people to choose the food that they eat?
Yeah, I think there's so much choice out there today, and there's so many different pieces of advice, so much different information floating around, that yes, we don't support what we call nanny state, but what we do support at the Heart Foundation is providing some tools that can help people to make that choice. And one of the labelling systems we're working very closely with is the new 5-star rating system. Now, no food labelling system is perfect, and I never claim any one is. But this system will enable people to look at a product quite clearly and be able to determine which one is the healthier in that category. So if something within a category of, say, cereal, or a category of yogurt, or a category of some other types of food has the numbers of stars on it, it will help you to determine which one might have the least amount of salt, fat and sugar within that category, and help you to choose. You may choose to purchase one with 2 stars, you may choose to purchase one with 4 stars. But what we believe in is providing tools that make it a bit easier for people when they go to a supermarket to be able to determine what is in the product I'm just about to buy.
And does that have
then
value,
make a choice.
Michael, from your perspective? I mean, you say that you're not really sure whether those things work. Does that have value?
Well, look, this is hotly debated in the nutritional literature, and I have to say that the weight of evidence is against it in terms of its efficacy, in terms of making a difference, a measurable difference to the body weight. I mean, in one sense, who could disagree with an action like that? Of course, people should be given information to make informed health decisions about what they eat. I've struggled to find a reason to be against that. The question, though, is whether or not it makes any difference to the levels of disease or the body weights of the population. And there are lots of very decent controlled studies in that area, and it's just very difficult to find any that have made a measurable difference. That is never a reason to say that we shouldn't do it, right? We often do things which we believe in, even if we can't put our finger on conclusive evidence that it works. But put it to you this way, if it were a crisis, if people really believed it were a crisis, would we be putting our eggs in the basket of policies like that? See, the really curious thing about this is that we often read that obesity is a more serious problem than global warming. I have a file in my office of about 200 newspaper articles thick, and I stopped collecting them when they stopped being on paper. And if that were true, what kinds of policies would we be implementing? If it were true, I reckon we should have police in the street stopping people from eating certain kinds of foods. That's what we should do. I just think nobody believes it.
Yeah, I just want to add to what's being said here, and I think it's interesting because the talk is very much, as I usually predict, it's going into the health territory. So tonight's about obesity, and yes, the obesity epidemic, but there is still a very strong link here being made between health and obesity, and I'd like to just question that a little bit. In terms of I suppose it also depends on how you see obesity. In the US, it's now obesity itself has been classified as a disease. Now, there's something that many of you probably know as an educated audience, that we have correlation and causation. Now, the fat acceptance movement doesn't claim that there is no link between certain health conditions and obesity, but we claim that they're being exaggerated, manipulated, and there are lots of reasons for that. Some of it's related to funding, who gets funding and why, and some of it is related to body policing as well. Now, my concern when we're talking about health and children as well tonight, and when if you're teaching healthy eating or a range of foods or even how to incorporate treats into a child's diet, most of us can't see much wrong with that, and I don't. But when you link that to obesity, you then create a fear of fat. And tell me those 10, 11, 12, or I think they're finding 8-year-old girls now who go on strict diets are not actually eating healthily. They're going into eating disorder territory. And a psychologist will tell you that if you weigh or publicly critique a child for their weight, if a parent has body issues or body image, maybe fat hatred issues, and if that child is ridiculed, say teased for being different, those three things are highly likely to end that child up in eating disorder territory.
So you think that our obsession with not being fat is actually making certainly children and lots of women, I imagine, fatter?
Well, actually there is some evidence, and Michael can perhaps even know more about this than I, but there is some evidence that the more you diet, your body then rebounds and becomes bigger and fatter.
But even just talking about it, I suppose, is what I'm asking. You know, just using words like fat. Oh, she's not. Yeah. Look at her. She's fat. I mean, that implants in children from a very young age this morality, and fear of fat was the phrase that you used.
Yes, fear of fat is something that our culture has, I think, strongly, and so that sense of and also you look at the way medical professionals treat their patients depending on whether they're fat or thin. You can have somebody who's actually eating very little and starving themselves, but who might still be in the overweight category, and they'll be praised for having lost weight, whereas you take maybe someone who looks emaciated and to the doctor, and they will have, you know, their eating labelled as perhaps an eating disorder. You actually get different treatment depending on how you look. And my concern is thinness at any cost. And I know that we have organisations saying that, no, when we're promoting a range of body sizes, you don't have to be thin and so on. But this, whenever you link it to obesity, you are saying that.
So we have a question down the back, which I'll go to in just a second. But as someone who is larger than what is deemed socially and morally acceptable, how does that play out in your life in terms of how people treat you, what they say to you, how they look at you? Does that palpably affect your life?
Well, I think that you could talk to anybody, and I would be considered morbidly obese, which is a really horrible word. I prefer fat myself, but basically, yes, it does. From a lot of different ways, from medical professionals to going into a shop that might not have your size, to people yelling at you on the street. To
you've had people yell at you on the street?
Oh, of course, regularly.
What do they say?
Well, the most one that I had was actually when a group, Jackie Wykes and a group of other fat women had started an Aquaporco group, which is a fat synchronised swim team. And it was, I suppose it's funny because my dad said, I guess that's a good way to get exercise. But it's a bit more political than that. It's saying, okay, we have a right to be in public spaces. People say that fat people should do exercise, but you go into a pool in your bathers, it is a political act. And also the fact that we're often told your body is not capable, or the implication is you're not able to do things because you're fat. And so if you can learn to do somersaults and synchronised swimming, then it's quite empowering as well. And so after we'd had our Aquaporco practice, and by the way, I dropped out. It was I'm not that coordinated, so but the team did end up doing a performance. After we had one of those sessions, we walked down the street to get coffee and a group of men yelled, "Go on a diet." So I thought, all right, that's pretty lame. But I was on the way to a lecture at where I work, Victoria University, recently, actually a little while ago, and somebody snorted like a pig in my face. And, you know, I took 5 minutes to collect myself and I went and did my lecture. And I try to remember that these people who are particularly prejudiced are probably, they're out there. What they think of me doesn't matter, you know. But I do think that some of these policies relating to obesity also give those people permission to be more prejudiced and and think they can do that.
Okay, question down the back. He's been waiting for a while.
Thanks for that. And sorry, I'm going to go back to a health question, but perhaps later we can hear a bit more about gender and obesity and thoughts around that. My question is perhaps to Michael, first of all. You talk about governments and their role in being responsive and the example in New York. I'm wondering if you can comment on freedom of choice and the power of food marketing and how you think that without government interventions people have free choice, or whether or not that is in fact constrained by the marketing that they're subject to.
Totally.
Yeah, it's a very... I used to think that was a simple question, but I don't have an answer to that question. I think it's... I don't know what the right answer to that question is. I certainly do think that there are costs, real costs, to telling people what they should eat in what we often tell ourselves as a free society, and that those costs should not be underestimated. It is certainly the case that research tells us that we often eat unthinkingly and that our food behaviours are influenced by factors that we are not aware of. So, for example, larger plates, people eat more. You give people a taller glass, they'll put less fluid in it, and you give them a larger glass, a wider glass, a larger, flatter glass, they'll put more in it. They'll actually drink more. You put soft lighting in it and people will eat more. So there are lots of reasons why it is at least arguable that we need to do something to affect what people eat without them knowing it. And it is certainly the case that the people who market food to us are hard at work day and night trying to find ways to trick us into eating more stuff. That is absolutely true. I just don't think the answer is to tell us what we can eat.
Ange?
I'd have to say that it can't be a coincidence that the commercialisation of food has occurred at the same time as the growing rates of obesity and overweight around the world. It cannot be a coincidence. And companies wouldn't spend hundreds of millions of dollars a year marketing bad food to people if that food was something we'd choose all by our own selves. They could save the millions and millions of dollars. Getting back to, I guess, the comments earlier as well about a nanny state, the connection there is that we live in a very short political cycle, yet we're talking about a long-term problem that requires long-term behaviour change, and hence our work with children. And I don't know how we can say that a certain policy around, say, food labelling is not impacting people's health or weight when it's going to take years for us as consumers to actually, A, get a magnifying glass big enough to read it, and B, understand what all these chemicals mean to suddenly say to ourselves, actually, this isn't food. You know, this is something that people are making a profit out of all around the world, but it's not food anymore. And that I guess comes back to the disconnect between where food really comes from and what we're being convinced to buy. So I don't think it's a nanny state when you give people a counter experience to one that's been heavily invested in for such a long time with a very positive and empowered experience. And so we live in the world of information. These guys would know that they have access to so much more information than any of us did at their age, and giving them the ability to discern this information and understand not just part of the picture but the whole picture so that they can choose. And then also respecting that when you talk about health policy, it's long term and it goes way beyond the cycle of a government in this country, and therefore we have to be patient and we have to think what makes sense, and surely giving people good information about food makes sense.
Sure. I would just say that people are changing. you look over the history of social policy problems with which we have grappled in the last 50 years, drug use, teenage pregnancy come to mind. Eventually, Western societies have worked out that that norms have changed and morals, behaviour have changed. And without us really knowing why, rates of teenage pregnancy across the Western world have declined in the last 20 years. We don't really know why, but they have. Rates of drug abuse have declined for the most part. We don't really know why, but they have. And I suspect they are because we've had these conversations. Intelligent human beings have decided to change slowly over time, and societies change. And I think that's as good as it gets, actually.
Okay, down the back.
I am interested in going back to the notions of morality in obesity. And I'm thinking about people's, often I think with very good intentions, desire to comment on other people's bodies constantly. Whether you're putting on weight or losing weight or however you might look on a particular day, I think people say, oh, gee, you look good. You know, and it's that thing about, you know, which in the converse of which, God, you looked bad before and now you're looking so much better. And it's just these things that I think that are completely ingrained in popular discourse. And I don't think they get called out very much, and I think it is hard to call them out. So I'm kind of interested in manners around our bodies and obesity and what the panel has to say about that.
Okay, we haven't heard from you for a while, Mary. Maybe we could hear what you have to say about that.
Yes, well, again, I think we don't promote bodies, we promote healthy eating and healthy weight, and we like
I don't
to
mean
have
as
that discussion.
as a foundation. I mean, you personally, do you see someone and you say, oh, you're looking good, have you lost some weight?
I have said it occasionally, yes, and I think it's something we probably all say, and I think it's just something we've got used to saying. Perhaps we do need to think about our conversation and think about how we address these sorts of things. But I think at the same time, we do need to talk to people about health. We do need to talk openly about how we're feeling. We need to talk about what we're doing. I mean, one of the big issues we face is that people are sedentary and not moving. And that's a huge issue for the population as well, is that our lifestyles have encouraged us to eat more and probably move less. So we have a campaign at the moment saying to sit less and move more. So I think we do need to have these conversations about our lifestyle, about what we're doing, what are the things that we're doing that are helping us, that are making us more energetic, what are the things that we are doing that are not helping us. And I think it's more about a broad discussion. It's the same with different food types that we eat. It's the same with the marketing.
I can still remember
kids in school.
I can still remember when I would have been about 15, I came out in a bikini and my dad looked at me going, oh, bit round around the middle there, darling. And I'm just thinking, and it devastated me, and thinking, and then getting really angry and going, well, who are you to be commenting on what I look at your bloody middle. But it was the moral, it was the liberty with which he felt he was entitled to comment on my body, which has really stuck with me. And I'd never really thought about it as being manners or not before, but it really has manners really matter to a society, don't they? And they go to the very heart of how we interact with each other.
Yeah, I'd like to answer something to do with that, and that is that, look, I think that it's part of our cultural conversation. Most people, I don't say that, but I don't say to somebody, you look great, you've lost weight. I mean, they might have cancer, you know. That might be why they lost weight. I do think it's rude, but I think it is part of our cultural, what's accepted. I've often been around, say, two women who are much smaller than me who talk about how they shouldn't be eating this or that, and they should diet, and they shouldn't, they've put on weight and that. And my take on that is, well, that's how insidious fat hatred is. They're not necessarily commenting on me. I'm sitting there much fatter than them, although, you know, it's interesting dynamic. They're commenting on themselves and body hatred. But as far as the moral side of obesity goes, I think just thinking about, in our culture, to be a good citizen, you need to be striving for health. You're seen as a bad citizen or not pulling your weight if health is not your top priority. And often being fat means, to a lot of people, they assume that you aren't health seeking if you're fat. So I'd just like to question that notion that you have to be doing that. And I call it healthism. It's a kind of religion. It's saying, follow the way we think, eat what we tell you. Obesity is bad. And if you don't believe that, then you're not part of our religion and you're not a moral citizen. And in these sort of forums before, I have had people say to me, you're a drain on society because you're fat and you're going to cost Medicare this amount of money. After time and thinking about that, I think, okay, that's a very neoliberal thing to say. Are we going to start saying, attacking the whole basis of Medicare in our country and saying, okay, this particular group of people who are obese don't have a right to use our resources? Actually, let's not let drug users use them either, or women who can't have children. That's not life-threatening. Let's not let them use it either. And so you start to attack a whole moral idea that we live with. And I just will touch briefly on what I mentioned before, correlation and causation. Okay, as an arts academic, I critique scientists on this quite often, which disturbs me, actually, that I can do that. But basically, that when you say, there was one particular study that I critiqued a while ago, and it was on The Conversation, which is an academic, where academic writers write, and it said obese male sperm is bad, basically. And then I went and read the original article, and it was done on mice or rats, and it hadn't been mentioned in the article, and they had taken a normal-sized rat and made it fat in about a month, like triple its size, then tested its sperm and said, oh, this sperm's bad. So let's write an article saying all men who are fat have bad sperm. So,
We've got a couple up the front, and then there's one down the back first of all, though, please.
Yeah, thank you. I think out of this whole argument or discussion point, we're forgetting 30 years ago, our children used to walk to school. They would have generally PE and run around the yard at recess, lunch times and afternoon tea times. They'd walk home. They'd run around the streets and play. When they go to work, they would generally perhaps be upstanding or doing physical work. Very much was not on sitting down all the time, whereas nowadays, kids are being driven to school, picked up, going home. They're really restricted from playing because the schools are frightened they're going to get hurt and the school will get sued. Most of us now sit on our bottoms and work. It's probably more the sedimentary lifestyle and not necessarily sedimentary that we don't do anything. It's part of how we have evolved within our workplaces. And finally, just as an aside, for mature age individuals, medical authorities now hope and pray that we all have a bit of condition on us, because if we have to go under surgery, we need something to keep us going and sustaining. In fact, we have a friend right now who is in hospital facing a major operation, but they are there to be boosted up on their body weight because they probably won't survive the operation. And isn't that part and parcel of this whole discussion point?
So, I mean, you make the point there about our sedentary lifestyles, and is it actually, do humans need to be moving? I mean, is that something that we need to be doing?
There was some research recently, Michael will probably know, saying that diet plays 90+% of the role in weight gain. Maybe the question is, yes, we're more sedentary, but does that give us more opportunity to eat because food is more accessible? And when you're sitting down or still, you can eat, versus when you're running down the park and walking to school with a school bus, a bit harder to eat.
Mm-hmm. I mean, when you're talking about an editorial in the British Medical Journal which claimed, the headline was, "You can't outrun a bad diet." And the claim was that it was really about food. Anyway, it caused the academic Twitter sphere, etc., to go into a complete meltdown.
Oh, I can only imagine.
There was exciting times. And in fact, that editorial, 2 days later, I went to that editorial and it had been removed from the British Medical Journal's site because of so many complaints. And I think the previous questioner's point is relevant here. Here's an interesting thing. If you try to find research saying that kids today are less physically active than kids of 30 years ago, you can't find it. Is it true? Does that mean it's not true? Well, I think we know that times have changed. I just think it would be unwise to generalise. Certainly, my mother's generation looked at her granddaughter's generation and couldn't believe the amount of physical activity that the young females in their family were doing. And my mother would no sooner have run around the block than flown to the moon. So I think we need to be careful about generalising about that. But it just so happened the academic who wrote that editorial had a cookbook to sell. He was one of the first people to publicise the paleo diet, and has made a huge amount of money and prestige about being one of the driving forces behind the paleo diet.
Well, we can go into paleo and all of the other various diets if we get some time about, what that's really all about. It's a very
Could I
interesting
just
sphere.
comment on that sedentary
sure.
lifestyle as well, if I may?
Sure.
Well, there is evidence out there that shows that 4 out of 5 children do not meet the physical activity national guidelines of 60 minutes of activity a day, and 2 out of 3 adults are sedentary or do very low levels of exercise. Now, again, nobody's asking anybody to go and run around the block or run a marathon, but what has changed since the 70s and today is that about 80% of children back then would have cycled or walked to school. And we now have a generation of the most chauffeured-driven children in the third world.
And
or
do
sorry,
we
the first
understand?
world.
Do we understand what the effect is of that, Mary? Do we know that?
Well, yes. Well, people are physically inactive, which is also affecting us. I mean, there's 2 streams to this. There's diet and there's exercise, and we run the 2 streams together. Physical inactivity in its own right is also a key risk factor for a number of diseases. But when you put the 2 together, you've got an extra risk. So we're really looking at physical activity and sedentary behaviour. And it's true, we drive to work, we sit and work all day, we go home, we sit and watch TV, we sit with our iPads or iPhones, and we're not moving around as much as we used to. We also believe that you need to break up sitting time. We promote stand-up desks, we promote stand-up meetings. Instead of sending an email, walk down the office to the next person and have a conversation and come back. So we are a lot more sedentary than we used to be, and that is also a key risk factor, because if we're not exercising and moving, we're not burning off the foods we're eating.
So we've got some disagreeing views here. So you're saying we are a lot more sedentary than we used to be. You're saying there's not really any evidence of that.
I think if we're middle class and we work in an office, we might be.
Right.
But there are a lot of other kinds of people out there too. And I think one of the things that hasn't been mentioned here tonight is the notion of privilege. So we talk about eating healthily, but if you go to some of, for instance, Indigenous communities up north in Kimberley, there might be food delivered that's kind of droopy vegetables that'll last 3 or 4 days and then run out, and it's very expensive as well. So you look at the structural things in place in this country, and I'm sure there are things being done to improve them, but there are a lot of those in, say, outer suburbs. Where are the community and sports centres for children? In areas where there aren't public transport, parents, you have to drive everywhere. In some remote communities, you're not getting access to fresh fruit and vegetables. And also we have to look at income. And the last thing I would say is, again, back to that notion of you needing to be a health-seeking individual to be a valuable member of our society. Now, if you happen to be a single mother and you work 2 jobs, what are your priorities? Perhaps your priorities are keeping your mortgage going and your child at school. Does that make you a bad person if you don't think about health much?
Or if you don't have time to go to the gym necessarily, or to do those sorts of things, those health promoting activities?
I'm sure there are things, and I think this is a good program, and I noticed on your website you don't, from what I could see, don't actually link it to obesity on your website.
No, we don't. We don't even mention the word health, really, particularly in the classes for the children, for that very reason, and there's no discussion about body image or, it's been suggested that we do some research where we measure children's waistlines and weigh them before they start the program, and that is just so the antithesis of what we're about, and we're about joy and pleasure, not guilt and fear. It really is flipping the thinking, and instead of, scaring people into eat things because of a pyramid or because of nutrient content, encourage people to seek the joy and pleasure out of fresh food, because fresh food is the best and most delicious.
We had our next question. There was some up the front. No, they gone. This lady here has been actually had hers down for a while, and then we'll go back to this to lady up here.
The lady from Victoria University.
Could you put your microphone closer?
The lady from Victoria University. You mentioned that you had people around you who were thinner, concerned about their weight. Do you think that nearly all women in society now are worried about their weight? Has the fact that we're so obsessed with it made everybody from normal weight up? So those women probably have as much mental pressure as anybody. Do you think that? And also, secondly, do you think it's easier for men to be overweight in this world than women? I know that's...
Yeah, I think that there's pressure for both genders, but I think if you look from a more sociological perspective, that women are still valued for their beauty and for attaining the beauty standards of whatever culture they're in, and men have a different set of measures, perhaps their earning capacity and so on. That's a bit of a generalisation. I do think that both groups, and actually men's masculinity can be attacked when they're fat, so this sense that you're not a real man or something comes in. But yes, I think the thing that fear of obesity or fat does is it makes most women, I think, probably in the Western world, have a lot of body issues and body shame and a sense of, oh, you know, I've had a baby 3 or 4 months ago, now I've got a stomach, I can't wear bathers this season. You know, so this sense that I can't be who I am, my body is not acceptable because there's a narrow view of beauty in our culture, not a sense that there's a body diversity, and you know, and that beauty can be found at different sizes. And I think the thing that we haven't brought up here tonight is that notion that alongside all of this talk of health, you've always had, or for a long time in this country, you know, magazines that show very slim models, and so especially young women and young girls are looking at that. So they're hearing, if they hear a health message attached to obesity and then they look in their magazines and see very, very slim women modelling clothes, that can, they're not going to separate those issues out. That's a sense of, to be in this society, I must be thin to be beautiful. That's where my concern over the whole psychology behind it comes in, that you're going to end up with a psychology of must be thin at all costs. And so that notion of even linking health to it goes out the window. So I think a message of body diversity and is a much better message, in a sense that, okay, as I said, I don't believe that the idea of you know, healthism or health at all costs to be, or else you're some kind of drain on society, is a good notion. But if you are in the industry and you're going to promote health and that's your job, then I think the kind of approach that's been taken by Stephanie Alexander is a good one. They're not going through lunchboxes saying, oh, you can't have a treat in your lunchbox and throwing it in the bin. I mean, I think that children need to be taught how to incorporate all kinds of foods into their diets and not to sort of ban, particularly if you ban, say, a high-calorie food, you're going to create an aura of, you know, mystery around it, and kids are going to be, you know, that's where you get that kind of secret binge eating starting to happen.
If you're sitting in this room and you do not daily think about your body shape, you're weird. That is to say, it's now normalised. So everybody, and the men in the room will probably be less anxious to own up to it, but we now all do it, and we have normalised it, and we are normalising it more and more. We are defining new technological ways for us to think about our body shape and what we put in our body all the time.
We can count our steps now all the time as well, wondering about how that's going to affect our body shape. Sorry to cut you off, Michael. I've just got a few more questions and we've only got 7 more minutes left, so I'd like to get to a few more.
Hi. Fast food chains. I work in Camberwell. There's virtually none there. Years ago, McDonald's, Hungry Jack's was virtually turfed out by the community. Very rarely do you see anybody too, you know, overweight. Go out to Fountain Gate, Dandenong, Cranbourne, where there's heaps of fast food chains. I'm talking about KFC and McDonald's and that. And there are, you know, it's quite a different demographic in terms of weight and a lot of overweight people. There's a GST on fast food. My question is, what impact will a GST be on fresh food when a lot of people that I know say they can't afford to eat fresh food now?
Okay, that's a pretty big question. So what?
But can I start on that?
Yeah.
I think there's a couple of issues there. One is that there is a perception that fresh food is more expensive than junk food, but I actually think that's a perception issue, not necessarily a reality. Yes, it's true that some organic produce can be expensive, but on the whole, actually fresh produce, if it's stored correctly, is way cheaper. But they're the skills that are lost. The preparation and the storage, and in fact growing your own at home, for instance, those skills have been lost. So the concept of junk food being cheaper, it's not about dollars cheaper, actually it's a combination of the perception of time cheaper and dollars cheaper, wrapped up with the concept of a treat and the psychology of a treat. So, and that is really the whole sugar concept as well that's been injected, I guess, into junk food. So my response to that would be, I think there's a real misperception out there, and once that perception is changed, and I think it is slowly changing now, there's a lot of work being done in those spaces to educate people about how to produce meals with fresh food quite quickly and cheaply. And I think once perception changes, people will start to appreciate that actually that skill around fresh food was something that comes to me at no cost versus spending money for something that is perhaps not helping my health.
So a GST, do you think that would make a difference?
I don't think it will. No, I really don't think it will.
Okay. Next question. I thought I saw another hand up there.
Just I was going to say that correlation causation issue comes in there. It's equally possible that not that the fast food restaurants in those districts cause the obesity, right? It could easily be the reverse, that the demand of the people who lived in those places were different, and therefore, I've lived near Mullumbimby, and I know how they fought to keep how they still fight to keep McDonald's out of Mullumbimby, right? So it could be the reverse, or it could be that there's no correlation, there's no actual relationship between the two either.
Okay.
Because I just mentioned that isn't a kind of an observation that, again, we make all these observations and generalisations without evidence, and I think we need to look at the evidence more carefully. And if you take a message away from today, that's what I would say is to go, and when you read the newspapers and the assumptions that are made about obesity and fatness and health, and even what makes you a good person or a good citizen, is to question what's being said. Because when you read a scientific article like the one I mentioned earlier about sperm, how many people went out there and said, oh, well, I better not get a fat partner because, they're not going to have a good baby, and how many people went and read the original research that showed that it was a huge generalisation.
By the way, fat people have more babies than thin people.
And there you go. I never knew. Let's just get this question here, and then I think this may be our last question.
Hi, this is for Michael. I have a question about motivation. I worked out for 40 years, and one day I got up and I just couldn't do it anymore. I couldn't lift another weight. I couldn't get on the treadmill. I couldn't do the cross trainer. I'd like to know, how do I get my motivation back?
Can I just say, before you jump in, do something you enjoy. Movement you enjoy. Okay.
Is there a movement that you enjoy? Maybe you're just bored.
That's exactly right. I'm just bored. I've been doing it for 40 years.
Why have you been doing it?
I'm 52 now.
Why have you been doing it?
Michael,
why have you been doing it?
Pardon me?
Why have you been doing it?
To stay thin. And
if you do something you enjoy, you will get the exercise benefits and endorphins and all of that, but it might not keep you thin. If you do yoga or Tai Chi or I don't know, whatever floats your boat.
I think we live in one great treadmill. Our society is becoming one. Health is becoming an ideology. That is to say that to be healthy is the way to be good. And part of the problem is that there becomes no way out, and it becomes a responsibility and becomes a routine. And if that's what our relationship to physical activity becomes, and our relationship to food becomes, then I don't want to live in a world like that.
Yeah, and I would just comment too that it is important, and I take up the point, Meg, that if you're going to do something you enjoy. Not everybody wants to go to the gym and get on machines. People want to go out for a walk. The Heart Foundation runs walking groups, which are social as well as exercise. People walk to work, they get off the tram, it stops sooner. Any kind of activity at all. It doesn't have to be that organised and that condensed. So look for something you enjoy. Dancing is an activity. Walking, it's about looking for something, and I agree. If you enjoy it, you'll do it.
That sounds like a pretty good message on which to end the evening. I've got a little clock down the front which is now beeping a red light at me, which I think means we're going to explode if we don't all leave the auditorium very soon. But look, thank you very much for coming along tonight. It's been a really interesting discussion, I think probably with some different perspectives that many of us hadn't really thought about, and some very differing viewpoints which we could have got more into as well. We could actually have this conversation for 3 hours, but do something that you enjoy seems to be the message that we can all agree on. So can I just have you thank our panel this evening, Mary Barry, Jenny Lee, Ange Barry and Michael Guide.